Okay, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to our webinar at the Anderson School of Management, UCLA's Anderson School. For you who do not know me, my name is Sebastian Edwards, and I am a professor here and the Senior Associate Dean for Global Initiatives. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you to another of our webinars. Today, we're going to be talking about the China-US relationship. The title is quite provocative, the China-US divorce, with a subtitle that brings it down a little. And it's a great pleasure for me that we have two fantastic speakers. Both of us have been with us in the past. Professor Christine Law, who is joining us from Hong Kong, and Professor Christopher Tang, who is joining us from California. Without any further introduction, let me tell you what the rules of the game are, and then we're going to start. We had scheduled this, at least on paper, for 90 minutes. We are going to aim at finishing in 1 hour, so that it's compact, it's to the point, and it's very fast-paced. I'm going to ask Professor Law, Christine, first to make some opening remarks, and then Professor Tang about this issue about is this really a divorce? Maybe it's a quarrel, maybe it's some distancing that will go away. And then we will take your questions through Slido. So you submit your questions, I read them, I then look at them, I sort of get a few of them together, and I ask our speakers difficult questions. My role is to ask them the most difficult questions that I can possibly find. So is this, Christine, we'll start with you. Is this a divorce? Is it a quarrel? And if it is a divorce, this is going to be one of those really nasty ones where they will be fighting for the china, for the dog, for everything, or can it be more amicable? So why don't you give us your opening thoughts?
Well, thank you, Sebastian. Well, let me use well, there are two narratives right now. One is divorce and decoupling, and the other one, of course, is this a Cold War? So, but let's stick, for the purposes of today, to the divorce decoupling narrative. And I'd like to start with offering kind of three kinds of narratives that may help us to explore the question that you've asked us. You know, how bad are things going in this relationship? So the first one is the marriage and divorce narrative. I think that if we are looking at this as a relationship, then obviously in a marriage there is a courtship period. Now then there might be some prenuptials, and then over time there is an intertwining of many interests that is just not even for the two parties, because there are other people who come into this relationship. So as I said, this intertwining of many layers of relationship, that if there is going to be some kind of decoupling, then what happened to all these relationships? Now, in any relationship, there are rough patches. So the question that we might want to explore today is this a bad, is this just a bad time, or are we really going to lead to a divorce? Now, in any kind of relationship, when you're in a rough patch, or if you actually head towards divorce, then it's painful. It's painful for the parties involved. It's painful for all these other people that are also going to be affected. And usually divorce is expensive. Now, so if we look at the relationship, US and China, of course, has a long relationship. But for the purposes of today, please allow me to pick 1971 as the start of this new period of relationship. Now, you will remember in 1971, this was when the Secretary of State, Kissinger, he went to Beijing, And it was the beginning of preparing a trip for President Nixon to go to China. And that was the beginning of a period of normalization. So you could say that this was a courtship period, and it actually took quite some years before normalization was put into its fullest shape. Now, this courtship and normalization had to do with history. When the two countries started coming together, it had to resolve problems that had been in existence since, you could say, at least 1950. That was when the US sent in the Seventh Fleet into the South China Sea, because the Chinese Civil War between the Kuomintang, the KMT, and the Chinese Communist Party was coming to a head, and the United States intervened by the Seventh Fleet to say, don't fight any further. So the normalization period had some prenuptials. The prenuptials was defining this relationship and saying, we'll let it be. Now, then you could say this part of the relationship, you could put an end to it at 2001. That was when China entered the WTO. Between the 1980s and the 1990s, China had developed very rapidly, and it had become the factory of the world. So you could say this is that earlyish part of the relationship. Now, between 2001 and 2016, you could say this is a period of time where there was globalization, where the interest of the two countries in their supply chains and their relationship became very much intertwined. Now, the current period, you could say, began with the current administration in the US in 2016 and up until 2020 today. So the question is, are we watching this relationship unraveling? And where might it go? So this is my marriage divorce narrative. Now, the second part of what I want to present is this breaking up. Are we breaking up? There's a lot of disillusionment, there's a lot of disappointment. So what are some of the key arguments between US and China? Now, US has been saying, well, China's doing very well. We're not sure we've got sufficient benefits out of this relationship. In fact, we think we've got a raw end of the deal. It's not been sufficiently good. We want more benefits. Another narrative from the US is China has just grown too quickly, too big, too fast. And hence you have the narrative of, is it that we need to contain China? This issue of containment. To the Chinese, this means you don't want me to continue to grow so quickly. Then there's a third narrative that is coming through, which is China now the evil empire? This is, that's why perhaps we need regime change in China. So if you flip to the Chinese side, the Chinese are saying, well, yes, with China become the factory of the world, with our increasing integration into the global system, actually American companies have been very profitable. They're also saying, as I continue to develop, I'm doing it my pace and my way. And of course, I'm doing this for the benefit of development of my people and my country. And lastly, the Chinese are also saying, well, actually, I don't plan to challenge the US leadership in the world, but I do want to grow and develop at my own pace and in my own way. Now, of course, the reality is, if we're looking at trade, China is pretty much everybody's major trading partner. If China is not the #1 trading partner, it is at least the #2 trading partner for many, many countries around the world. So as I said, this is the second type of narrative, the kind of debate about what China and US should do. In this narrative, it does offer potential opening for the two countries not to get into divorce. Now, lastly, I want to talk a little bit about the brawl itself. You know, the two parties are arguing publicly with each other. So brawls are not pretty. So what are the sort of things that we're seeing this relationship arising to? So first of all, from 2018, there's a trade conflict. And within this trade conflict, initially it's about reducing the US deficit, but it seems to have gone further than that. And we're going to hear from Professor Tang within this trade conflict, the nature of the changing supply chains. The second narrative in this brawl is about technology. And Huawei is the poster child of the problems between the US and China. We're now seeing TikTok. We're seeing, we're going to see other companies sort of having to choose sides. And we're having to witness other people with interest in the US-China relationship asking themselves whether they have to take sides. So it's rather difficult. And in the technology conflict, it also has an impact on supply chain. Now, beyond that, there are other conflicts. First of all, we have COVID-19, which is still very much with us in the US and elsewhere in the world. In this, we can also add travel and visas. At UCLA, I think we're very conscious of the fact of whether the US is going into a period, not just focused on China, but more so about visas in general, overseas students. There is a particular perspective in respect of China, which is the STEMs, the science and technology students. And very recently, there is now a narrative emerging as to whether the US would put some kind of restriction on Chinese people visiting the US. There's been talk about whether there might be restriction on Communist Party members and their families, but this could end up being 250 million people apparently. So again, using visas to weaponize the relationship is also quite concerning. Now, of course, there is finance. There could be sanctions against certain people, which also goes towards who they bank with. And this is, again, a very sensitive point for people in financial services. And lastly, of course, there are military issues. The concern in Asia is the South China Sea going to be an area of potential conflict, where, of course, the price is extremely high. So I'll just end this part by saying that where do we go from here? What might the relationship be like between US and China in, let's say, 2021? Is it that we can go through a period of counseling where the two parties can think more deeply about their relationship? And actually, we're also seeing all these other people, other countries, other industries and companies coming into this discussion because they all have an interest in how it develops. And lastly, I do want to say, at this moment in time, because of COVID, the world's going into recession. It's a very tough time for everybody. Countries are going to be in debt for a long time. And COVID is going to continue. And as we move from 2020 to 2021, what options do we have to de-escalate and to de-weaponize the ability that these two big powers have to perhaps go into a period of time where their and other people's interest could be better considered?
Christine, thank you so much. That was wonderful. I loved the way you handled and dealt with the metaphor of the divorce. And we're going to move to Chris Tang now. But before that, I just loved what you said about, well, maybe in this relationship, we need to now go to a period of counseling. Now, in order to have counseling, you need a counselor, someone who is going to come between and help the parties talk to each other and to come to terms. So one question that we may want to address in the next rounds is who could play that role. I'm afraid that if I quickly go through the world, the closest that I get to it is Madame Merkel, but Angela Merkel is on her way out, and I cannot see who is going to be the counselor. But let's wait. And now, Chris Tang, please tell us what you think about this divorce. Is it a divorce, or it's just maybe the sensational media is just making this big when really it's life the way it normally is? Tell us what you think.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, and thank you for having me. And also, it's an honor to be sharing the session with Christine. Now, before I start, let me tell you a little bit about my reaction to the metaphor about the marriage and counseling. Christine and I actually wrote two pieces in the newspaper, one in Barron's and one in South China Morning Post, to talk about this kind of divorce. Is there any way to mend this relationship? Interestingly enough, we received around 50 comments. It reflects the world is getting extremely polarized. Most of the comments say, well, it's time to split. There's nothing we need to talk anymore. Let's shut the door. Now, I'm so glad that Christine talked about counseling issues, and then Sebastian talked about who should be the counselor. Now, before we do that, so let me pose three questions first as a marriage counselor. I am not married, but some of my friends, they are legal counselors. So I did actually talk with them on the phone. They said, well, before a couple get divorced, usually you need to ask some basic questions. So I'm going to start with three questions and then comment on these three questions. Question number one, what was the original intent for the US to engage China in 1980? Was it because of mutual economic benefits? Or was it a political agenda during the Cold War at that time? That's question number one. Question number two is that how come or why? Why and how did US become so dependent on China? We had NAFTA, there's Mexico, there's Canada. Why we actually end up depending so much on China? That's question number two. Question number three is that, well, if this couple said they were married or they were being together intertwined, then the question was the relationship, was it really a true partnership that was built on trust or mutual respect? And also, how did this relation change? Because this narrative, that's what Christine pointed out, it did not surface until recently. Okay, so I'm going to comment on these three questions so that we can discuss further. Question number one. Suppose that the intent for US engaged China at the time was triggered by the fact that US was losing out to Japan in terms of manufacturing. So therefore, at the time, let me focus on the period from 1980 to 2020, because I arrived in the United States in 1981 when President Reagan started his office as president. At that time, the belief was that we should focus on trickle-down economy, all right? Because at 1981, US also has a recession. So then the question is, well, maybe we should not focus on manufacturing because China is opening up. let them do the low labor work. So we elevate our Americans to do value added work. So in the case, they don't need to work so hard, and then let China do the work, all right? So that is how it started. Now let's see what happened, all right? In 1980, I have some statistics. In 1980, the US GDP was $2.9 trillion, 2.9. 2019, the GDP of the United States is 21.3 trillion. So it went up 10 times. So US actually gained with this in this relationship. At the same time, the GDP per capita also gained 5 times. So in the case, if truly from the economic benefit side, US got the deal. Now then, as Christine pointed out, should the deal be bigger or smaller? That is up for discussion. Now let's look at the China side. In 1980, the GDP was 150 billion, very small. But 2019, the GDP is 12 trillion. It went up 80 times. US only went up 10 times, but China 80 times. And also the people, GDP per capita, went up 57 times, all right? So this relationship has helped China tremendously. In terms of the poverty rates, it was for around 90% in 1980, but now it's down to 1.7% in China. It has lifted over 900 million people out of poverty in China. Phenomenal, okay? 40 years. Now look at what happened to the US. In 1960, President Lyndon Johnson declared the war on poverty. At that time, the poverty rate was around 15%. Guess what happened today? After 50, 60 years, the poverty rate in the US is still 11%. It did not really change anything, didn't change much. The poor states, like in the South, continue to be poor. So that would trigger some of the unhappiness. They say, wow, China is so poor, now they become much richer. And US, the poverty rate is continue to be poor. So that is part of the problem. Now, then the question is not just only that. Because a lot of the Americans, they feel that they shifted the jobs to China. Now, then the question is, why did that happen? I'll come back to that. So that means that if you're purely looking at from the economic benefits, both countries got what they wanted. Now the question whether the split is not fair enough or not, that's different. That is like any couple. It said, well, I take the trash cows, you cook the dinner, so is it the fair trade? That is hard to say. So I think this one they need to go through counseling to figure out. Question number 2. How did China become so dependent on China? That's a good question. I always wonder, US and China are very different to begin with. Different political system, different economic system, because US believe in the supply side economics. So that means it's a low tax, no government regulations, let the market drive what they want to do. No coordination. Now, but China, they focus on demand side economics. They say we want harmony. We want full employment. That's why the SOEs, they're not efficient. They know that. It's not the case they don't know. But keep people employed. If once you have to get the full employment, you have harmony, then the country continue to grow. Third, culture is completely different. United States is the most litigious society in the world. We have more lawyers per capita in the world. You know that. But in China, it's actually they're more relationship, kind of informal relationship kind of process. And also civilization. US is a young country. It's only 240 years old. But China, well, depending how you argue, it's around 5,000 years. So in that case, it's a very, very different. But then the question, how could they get together? These two couples, this couple is from different world, right? Now let's go back to 1981. I think President Reagan was thinking that, hey, we cannot compete Japan. Let us pivot. Let us change to service economy, all right? So in that case, China opened up, perfect deal. In that case, we ship the job there, we outsource, okay? So what should we outsource to begin with, all right? the most natural thing to outsource is the job that Americans don't want to do, okay? I used to work at the IBM factory on project. I used to work in the factory for HP. I see how this job changed. At first, it's okay. We did the assembly work at IBM, $20 an hour in 1991. The factory workers make more than I did. I was just a research assistant. Cannot do the job because it's too mundane, too repetitive. They're not interested. Then IBM has to shift the job to Mexico, Guadalajara, all right? $1 per hour. But then later on, China said, well, we can do it for 50 cents. It's, oh, wow, that's even better deal. Then they move to China. Then later on, okay, not just computer components, toys, textile, clothing items, fine. Let them do the sewing, let them do the assembly work. Then after you've done that, they say, oh, why we need the machine to do the job? So, oh, let us outsource those components to China. Let them do the component assembly. They assemble the equipment. Then now they have the sewing operations. They have the machine do the sewing operations. Then next one, oh, how about textile? Oh, well, because instead of doing, we design the fabrics, let them do the design as well. So in the case, it's similar supply chain. So bit by bit by bit, the entire supply chain is not here in the US anymore. It's all done in China, including R&D, because it's much efficient, much more cost effective to do everything within one area. Now, once you start doing that, countries such as Mexico cannot compete. So even Mexico also outsources to China. So other countries, gradually everything become short to China. That's why eventually it became the factory of the future of the world, right? So in that case, China has never forced any country to outsource to them, but they're willing to take up the job, willing to move up the value chain, then gradually they actually take up the entire supply chain. Now, but then the question is that once you shift all this out, the capabilities is gone. So that's why, not just in terms of basic mundane work, the research is also gone. I used to work at IBM Research Center. Most of the research pretty much done. AT&T Bell Labs, gone. GE Research Center, pretty much bare bone. Xerox Research Center, gone. So basically, all the research centers companies, they no longer invest within the United States for this kind of research development. Consequently, the students, our American students, they don't want to study STEM because their job prospect is limited. That's why that now in the United States, we only produce 500,000 STEM student graduate each year. China has 4.7 million. Let me repeat one more time, it's 4.7 million STEM graduates. Then the question, now we're losing the capability. So that's why US is really depending on China to produce many components. Right now, as you may know, even US cannot produce a Kindle or the iPhone. If you completely source from US, it's not available because they don't have the capabilities. Not only that, you can check, even Pentagon, even acknowledge that a lot of weapons, some of the circuit boards, some components, they actually make in China, okay? So in the case, now we get at this stage. Then the question is what to do next, right? That is complicated. That's what I mean by intertwine. Let me go to the third question. US and China been married for close to 40 years. What has changed? Because initially they were happy and something must happen. Okay, let us recount what happened then. Okay, 1980, US a dominant force. China needs US. Then Chairman Tang at the time, the famous slogan is hide your strength, buy your time. But then later on, they changed the narrative, all right? So up to 2013, President Xi is now thinking about, hey, it's about time. We no longer need to buy our time. This is our time, right? So from their perspective, now we have the entire supply chain with the know-how, with the capabilities, with One Belt, One Road initiative. We have the Make in China 2025, and we have the Huawei, the 5G development. So we have all the ecosystem to actually reclaim or maybe to reemerge as a global superpower. Because a lot of the time, people may not remember China and India, they were the world economic power many centuries before, right? So and therefore, now it's come to the tension now, because now China become maybe, as Christine talked about, the second narrative, become too strong. Maybe US thinking, well, maybe we need to put China under control. I don't know. But then the question is what to do now. So I think I'm going to stop here, and then we can have a further discussion.
Wonderful, Chris, Tang, that was amazing. And I think that you were, Christine and Chris, maybe you were coordinating behind my back, because it fits so well, each of your parts. So my comment, Chris, to what you said is I like very much when you said that the US and China were so different culturally and in terms of how litigious they are and so on. And within the metaphor of a relationship, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, people who are different get fascinated with each other and become attracted. But with time, that attraction and those differences maybe start eroding, and problems starts popping up. So listen, we have about half an hour, a little less, and what I would like to do is ask you questions. I'll get questions from Slido. Let's assume that this is like a TV interview. So try to be very brief in your answers, and so that we can get as many as possible. So the first question that I want to bring in, Christine, and both of you, has to do with what Christine said about other countries coming into this discussion. And then, of course, Chris also talked about that, how the US first moved, or US companies moved manufacturing to Mexico and then to China. But then Mexico started outsourcing to, so the third countries. And what I need to do, or I want to do, this is a difficult question. Both of you come from Hong Kong and studied part of your career in the UK. The UK is now part of this discussion. And from my perspective, what I find fascinating is that the UK has said, we will give citizens of Hong Kong 200,000, 300,000 visas to move to the US, to the UK, and they will come with their STEM certificates, their knowledge, their industriousness. And how do you think this notion that the UK is saying, listen, you are in Hong Kong, you don't want to stay here, there, come, you're welcome, we'll give you a visa, move here, we need you, we want you, we love you. You both live in the UK. Do you think that this makes sense? Will it work? Will it help either side? Or is this interference of the UK going to make everything more difficult? Let's start with Christine.
I think what you're seeing in the world is many of, we talked about the intertwining relationships. So how many people are intertwined in this relationship? So obviously there are countries, there are governments that are articulating what their interests might be. There are companies and entire industries that have their interest embedded in this relationship, because it covers manufacturing, it covers trade, it covers finance, it covers technology, it covers education. I mean, it covers just so many things that everybody is being messed up a bit. Now, so what I want to say then is, okay, what are we going to do? You're beginning to see other people voicing out the dangers of a complete divorce. So who are these people who are beginning to say, we're not sure we want this relationship to go down that way? I think the EU have sort of said it. They want to do their own thing in terms of their China relations. Secondly, is ASEAN have said it, that they basically said, we don't want to be squeezed in the middle to have to take sides. And I think you're going to see many countries saying this. And you are seeing in the US, for example, very distinguished people in diplomacy, joining together. I think this was maybe 6 weeks ago, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, where a group of them came together to sort of say, we don't want to see a total breakdown of this relationship. And most recently, the Wang Yi, who's the foreign secretary, the foreign minister for China, he says, okay, let's look at US-China relationship from 3 perspectives. Where are those areas where we can still talk to each other and do something? Where are those areas where we're having some problem and we need to, you know, maybe solvable? And thirdly, let's have a category of stuff where it's really, really difficult for us. So we can see this relationship more clearly as to where possibilities are for salvaging the relationship.
Thank you, Christine. You did not answer my question about what would happen with the very massive number of visas that the UK wants to. But it doesn't matter. I will go back to, and what you answered was very interesting. I will go back to that because it's being caught up in Slido, and they are asking related questions. But so, Chris, I am interested in the 200,000 visas to Hong Kong. It's a lot of visas, is this, and it's part of the whole equation, although it's a third party coming in. What's your take on this? Is Boris Johnson posturing? Does it make any difference? It's why don't you tell us what you think about that?
Well, let me first clarify. There are 250,000 BNO passport holders right now, but then there are actually around 3 million people. They were eligible by the UK government's claim. Now, but then if you look at the people in Hong Kong, I think that they, as what Christine pointed out, is intertwined. The life of people in Hong Kong is rather complicated. On one hand, both Christine and I were born in Hong Kong. On one hand, we're Chinese by blood, but we also have the British influence, British education, and US influence as well. So in the case, actually, we view that both are important to us. So in the case, we don't want to choose side either. I think that is very important. So if even you ask a lot of people deep rooted, actually a lot of people in Hong Kong, the tradition is still very Chinese. Although they have a different narrative, but actually the upbringing is very similar. So I think that's why Christine and I feel deeply about this subject, because we hope that if there's a way for them to both US and China and EU and UK to have a world all coexist, living in harmony. So that I think that is the best world.
Let me move then to a slide. Let me move to a Slido question, which is a difficult question. It's related to what I just said. So the last time I checked the Slido, the most popular question was related in some way to this, what I just asked, and it has to do with human rights. And it says, Professor Tang, neither Professor Tang or Professor Lowe mentioned that these differences that Sebastian said made the countries or people when they get in a relationship to be attracted to each other, neither of them mentioned that part of this difference is the attitude towards human rights. And that it's so different that even with counseling, it will be very difficult to keep the marriage together. And then they go back to the question I asked earlier, who could do the counseling? I mean, certainly now it's me talking, it's not going to be the UN. This is, I mean, it's way above the UN pay grade. How could, I mean, this would be self-counseling, maybe an app, counseling.com. Who could do this? Okay, I volunteer, but I don't think that they will take my offer. So let's go to it, Chris, first. Very briefly, if there is counseling, what would be the procedure, the process? Will they go to Reykjavik, like the Soviets and the US did towards the end of the, I mean, they go to Iceland, where there are only 300,000 people total. And you sit there in the middle of the geysers, and how do they do this? How, the counseling, how do we do this practically? We are
Okay.
managing, you are management people. So, okay, let's, whoever wants to start. Why don't we start with Chris? Let's alter the order.
Okay. Well, I don't have the wisdom, but I think that I have read a few articles around this subject. If I have to pick one, if I have only choose one country that will serve as more, both country respect and also perceive is more neutral, I will pick Singapore. Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong has written a fantastic piece in the Opinion magazines. He was saying that he's hoping US and China will not force all the countries to pick side, because they worry about if you have to force them to pick side, they will force only one country will stand. But this time it will be unlike the last Cold War, that one would just quietly just disappear. But I think that this time it could be much more severe. And I think that that's why that they hope that is any way to do the counseling to repair which parts you can really tolerate, which part you can cooperate, which are the red zone that you just cannot talk about. So this is actually happening in any relationship. You know the boundaries, right? So I think that the certain elements actually China cannot change, because they actually fundamentally, they don't believe they want to change, because actually they believe that what they're doing is correct. So
No,
this,
wait. You need to clarify. You just said that these are two parties that are quarreling and we need counseling. And then you said one of the parties does not want to change because that party believes that what he or she is doing is correct. Did you say that? Did I understand correctly that
yes,
you said that?
for certain
So
elements.
how are we, I mean, the
Wait,
first
wait,
thing the counselor is going to tell you, if you don't want to change, it ain't going to be solved, my friend. So you better rethink that attitude.
No. Because when you ask someone to change, that means that you're blaming someone, what this person doing is wrong. But unless this person felt that they truly internalize, truly believe it is wrong, otherwise, why should they change? So look at the economic system. If you look at the China, for the last 40 years, they have done a phenomenal job. Throughout history, no country can actually change so fast within 40 years. Of course, it comes with a price, no question about it.
Okay.
But that at this juncture, at this juncture, now maybe it's say, well, let's take a step back. Are we ready to change? Are we actually willing to have a political reform? That's the next question. But then the same thing about the US. So, well, if you look at for the last 40 years, is the current system working or not? Question number one, the free market economy. I have doubts. I know Milton Friedman, Nobel Prize winner, pushing for that. Now look at what happened in the US. The top 1% has the wealth of the remaining 40% of the entire country, right? And also the CEO compensation. You look at the US system and say, well, this is a benchmark, global benchmark. You can ask the poll, you can do the poll for the entire Americans to think about the CEO compensation. The CEO compensation in 1980 is 50 times of the average salary of a worker within the same company. Today is 400 times more. In the extreme case, Gap company, the CEO salary is 3,000 times of the median salary of the employee in the company. So therefore, I think that before you say, well, one side need to change, other side need to change, I think maybe council say, hey, maybe both sides need to change. Maybe both sides need to rethink.
Okay, let me, I have opinions on what you said, but it's not about me. Christine, I want to expand the question about the counseling. Now the most popular question in Slido is related to this one. How will counseling and the relationship change under the increasingly possible, according to the polls, Biden administration? The polls released in the last few days give former Vice President Joe Biden a very significant lead over President. How will they change? So let me try to give a little structure, more structure to this. My take is that the language used by a President Biden will be very diplomatic and respectful. And he will move away from the offensive language used by the current president. On the other hand, a Biden administration is going to be much more focused on human rights in China. So there's going to be changes that are good for improving the relationship on the one hand, good language, respect, dignified, cooperate. And on the other hand, the State Department is going to start pushing much harder on the human rights issue. What do you think? What do you think a Biden administration, possible Biden administration? How will things change in that case?
Well, that's above my pay grade. But what I do want to say is, if one was going into some kind of counseling, there is some preparation before and during counseling that is important. You know, I think as Chris and Sebastian, you've both said, you've got to be willing to do it, and you've got to be open to listening to the other side, because the other side helps to give you a perspective about your own behavior. And because we're talking about international relations, it also matters that in this process that you hear from the others. So for example, Chris said, who might provide the platform for some kind of counseling? And he suggested Singapore, because don't forget, the Singaporeans provided the location for US and North Korea to get together. So what I'm saying is, you need a very skillful counselor who understands the lay of the land, who isn't going to take sides. I mean, this is the issue. The counselor is a neutral party. So is it possible for there to be neutral parties? Now, you also talked about the American political establishment. If Biden is going to be the next president, can you conceive of a situation where the Democratic Party and the Republican Party first goes through a little of preparation themselves? How do they truly see the US-China relations? So for example, Chris has laid out a kind of history, you know, who benefited, to what extent, and so on. You know, you need to prepare yourself before you come into a process to talk to each other. And perhaps in Congress itself, it's time for the two parties to actually have some kind of mediated discussion amongst themselves about about the polarization of issues in the US itself. Because what you don't want to do going into real counseling is you weaponize your own discussion only to hit the other side. And the Chinese have already actually opened the door to saying, well, you know, we can split up our discussion into 3 buckets. Those where we say, look, we should continue because it makes sense for both of us. The easier issues, then you have a bucket of, well, you know, this is where we're going to have some argument, but we might come to some agreement. New rules of engagement, and human rights might be in this area. And then there is a third category of really hard issues. What exactly are in that really hard ones? So I think we need to. I think the Democratic Party and a possible Joe Biden administration, if they really want to deal with China, they need to start thinking about, first of all, preparing themselves. It's not about weaponizing the power that we have and shooting.
Yeah. So no, I that's a very good point, Christine. But of course, there are all these people who will come with Biden that have spent their lives doing this. So let me move to Chris, who raised his hand. But I want you, Chris, to address what Christine said. But I'm going to add something a little difficult here. As I look at something called the tracker of the U.S. Naval Forces, I found out something that I did not know about, and that is that out of the 105 naval warships deployed around the world, 62 belong to the 7th Fleet around the South China Sea, or in Japan. They are actually in the base in Japan, but they are patrolling. So more than half are right there. Does that create or add to the sense that there is tension, or it doesn't matter? I mean, the ocean is so vast that no one sees them and they just are moving around. I mean, I was surprised. I don't know if you knew that 62 out of the 105 belong to the 7th Fleet. Okay, Chris, your turn.
First, let me comment on that, your previous comment first, and then I want to go back to Joe Biden's campaign. In terms of the current narrative with the current administration, my worries is that now is really try to escalate to the next level. And the question is that, is it a constructive mechanisms to have this kind of relationship with China or not? That's question number one. I think that's part of the thinking right now is actually maybe US and China, they are stuck in the Graham Allison's famous book on the Thucydides trap. In terms of the rising power and the incumbent power is in conflict, then they think that they may need to engage in this kind of threats. But to me, that is not necessarily the most effective way to deal with this situation. Now let me get back to Biden. In July, just 2 weeks ago, because I work in supply chain, I was pleasantly surprised that in his campaign, on his website, the key element is about supply chain. He is going to invest $700 billion to rebuild some kind of industry commons in the United States, especially for PPE, for critical equipment, and some drug manufacturing. He would like to shift some of the manufacturing back in the US. Now, that is a good first step. But I hope that if he became the president, if he were to reconsider that, US has lost a lot of capabilities. So this is a time for the US government to rethink carefully how to shift the paradigm, if you will. Thinking about US deindustrialization in the 1980s, is it time to re-industrialization in the 2021? That's question number one. Second, if you want to regain the traction of the industrialization, you need to have a plan, not piecemeal solution, not just poking on the circuit board you did here, your equipment's there. You need to come up with a holistic plan to build the ecosystem in the US. You need governments, companies, and universities to work together to have a right education, the right industry. Before US, they have the job training program started by Reagan, $3 billion per year. That led to nothing. Why? Because they did not have a plan in terms of what kind of industry is needed, what kind of training are needed for these people who may lose their job in the factory so they can retool them for the new industry. There was not a plan because of the free market. So I think that now the question is that I was also very surprised by Marco Rubio. He also has a new narrative about industrial policy, a strategic plan for the nation. So I think that hopefully the Republicans and the Democrats, both parties can work together to come up with a national plan for the people.
Okay, that's very. Maybe we should do another webinar on that whole question, which is should the U.S. become a centrally planned economy rather than be guided by the invisible hand. I am an invisible hand person myself, so we could have a debate, Chris, between you and I. And I used to work in a planning office, solving input-output problems and inverting input-output matrices in order to decide how much steel should be produced in order to be able to manufacture the number of cars that we wanted to do. So I know a lot about that. So, but that's a different story. We are coming up to the end. Christine, are there any final words that you would like to tell us? The one thing that we have sort of talked around it, but not straightforwardly. And maybe you could, if you want to address that, is intellectual property. There are a couple of questions here in Slido that have to do with that. Part of the whole discussion is intellectual property, royalties, patents, and so on and so forth. Do you think, Christine and Chris, that there is, because that's very concrete. This doesn't even need a counselor. I mean, you can go to anywhere and sit down and have a list of issues and say, this is what I want, and the other side says, well, maybe, this one no, this one yes. Can we make progress on intellectual property in the next couple of years, Christine?
Would have thought so, because the US has tremendous capability for innovation and, you know, lots of IP. And then I think the Chinese, the accusation of China is it's stolen knowledge. But at some point, you know, now that it has a lot of its own IP, you know, the narrative over the past 20 years is, you know, developing countries, as they become more capable, they will want to protect IP because they'll have their own. I think China is at this stage. So I think on IP, I would say that this is an area, again, using the 3-bucket narrative, that this is something that US and China can reach, you know, a new rules of engagement on. But maybe your point about central planning or the invisible hand is a very interesting issue, because if we look at, you don't just have to look at China, you can look at Vietnam, you know, in the COVID-19 area. There is something about national capabilities to be able to do certain things when it's required. Now, in the US, I mean, obviously the capability is there somewhere. So I think the Americans might want to ask itself, what is the process it needs to amass its undoubted capabilities to come together for, you know, major issues that face either the country or the world, things like, you know, COVID, pandemic, or climate change. So it brings a real problem to the table, where if you look at the United States itself, obviously enormously capable, when it has to deal with another country like China or maybe the EU, that there's actually some excitement in talking about a collaboration. Whereas right now, the concern, the narrative that we worry so much about is we just want to look at ourselves and what is, it's good for me. I don't care if it's good for someone else.
That's very very interesting. We started a little late, so I'm gonna take advantage of that. We told our guests that it was an hour and a half to go over by a little bit, not too much. Chris, we had you before in our Center for Global Management series, and you talked about supply chains. It was fascinating. One of the things that I've found since you spoke is that many companies and countries are trying to diversify their sourcing. And companies that I work with here in the US that were sourcing everything from China are beginning to source stuff from Mexico, although it's a little more expensive. Now, it turns out that after doing all the bidding and all the engineering, guess who is going to provide their parts in Mexico? It's going to be the Foxconn plant in Baja California, in Tijuana. So it's the Chinese that are now in Mexico. So in terms of the geopolitical, don't you think that the fact that it's still going to be Chinese, it's going to generate some tensions, and those tensions will continue to be there? Or do you think that if they are in Sao Paulo or in Nairobi, it makes a difference?
Well, thank you. First of all, I want to clarify, Foxconn is not a mainland Chinese company. It's the Taiwan company. Okay, that's point number one. Point number two is that what your example is a perfect example to talk about how the world is become intertwined, right? So, for example, even in the US, a lot of people may not realize that the GE appliances is actually owned by Haier. So basically, that's the co-ownership, who produce what. So now actually the world become more intertwined. Now the question is that if you say, well, you don't want China to make certain things, are you talking about end to end or just part of it? If you want the entire product without anything touched by the mainland China, it will be very difficult. Just like in terms of now, a lot of companies, they're diversifying into Vietnam. Do you know that many of the factories in Vietnam, they're owned by Chinese? So that we have to be careful. Are we talking about China as a nation or Chinese as a people? These two could be quite different, all right? So we'll keep that in mind. So finally, I think that at this juncture, US has two choices, it seems. One is to view China as a threat and need to be controlled, and then maybe some confrontation, or US can actually accept China to coexist as a major power. The world will know that these two superpowers, they have to compete in some way, like the three buckets. But also, the world also look to them as a superpower to cooperate in some sense. Because I think no matter what they choose in the end, I think the whole world is still prefer to have some kind of harmony. They don't want to choose sides. They just want to coexist. Everyone live in peace.
Okay. Last question. This is a really difficult one for you guys, I think. There is news that's come up recently about the Muslim population in China and forced internment, and any thoughts about that? I will make it very open so that you can delve on it in any way you want. Any comments on that particular issue? Christine?
Well, we're in the human rights bucket, right? This is a difficult issue because it has to do with,
sorry for interrupting. How do you pronounce the name of those people? I didn't pronounce it because I'm afraid that I'm going to mispronounce it.
Yes, the Uyghurs.
Uyghurs, okay.
In Xinjiang province. Now, let me just give you a very short summary of how China looks at her threats, because it has to do with China's fear of her borders. The difference with the US is up there, and it has Mexico and it has Canada just on two sides of her border. In China, China is surrounded, she has many countries around her border. And the concern in China is disunity, the breaking up of the nation. So it's generally pretty tough on the periphery, where she sees it as a national security threat. Issues about separatism is a very, very major issue for the Chinese mindset about national security. And the Hong Kong issue about independence movements in Hong Kong, it's the same thing. So you could say you have Xinjiang province at the top western end of China, and you have Hong Kong at the southern tip of China. Now, I'm not condoning, obviously, any human rights abuse in China itself, but I just want to lay this out as how a country sees its threat. I'd like to think that it is possible for the US and the EU to work with China on these kinds of issues. We also must be aware that from China's point of view, China will have her debating points about human rights abuses in the US, right? So now all I'm saying is, if we can see ourselves as having three buckets of easier to much more difficult discussion, is it possible to conceive of having these discussions, these dialogues between the US and China? If it is, how could it proceed? don't forget that Secretary of State Pompeo and his counterpart, Yang Jiechi in China, have already met and had a 7-hour discussion. Now, if you can imagine what they said to each other, it might be, here's my red lines. Don't go across this, because those are in the most difficult bucket. So there is an opening for the Biden administration to really think about how to use the best of US leadership in the world to have this kind of process. I think it will be uplifting if we're prepared to have this kind of discussion without the US weaponizing the power that it has in military, financial, and sanctions that is freaking out the world, frankly, not just China, but the rest of the world.
Last word, Chris. Thank you, Christine. That was wonderful.
Thank you. I think Christine responded beautifully. But I think I want to add a couple more points. I think US should engage maybe from other allies like the EU or UN to really have an open discussion with China in terms of the 3 buckets, which one you can compromise, which one you cannot. If you cannot, then try to understand why. Because I visit China often, and also I hear not just from the Chinese government, even from the Chinese nationals, how they feel about Xinjiang and also Uyghurs. So I think that they have to understand the fear and the concern. Then the question, is there any way to work out a compromise? I do not know what the solution is, but I do know one thing. So maybe I borrow Churchill's famous quotes. It's always better to meet jaw to jaw than war. I hope for peace.
That was a very good way to end our conversation. I hope for peace and prosperity and friendship, all the people together. So I want to thank our 2 speakers, and I want to thank our more than 200 participants. This was wonderful, and we will continue to have these conversations. Hopefully, sooner rather than later, we will all meet in person and have a great discussion. And I want to remind everyone that UCLA has a very deep commitment towards the Pacific, towards Asia, and Chinese studies. We have here 2 wonderful colleagues that come from Hong Kong and that have made a career doing research that touches on those issues. There are many other colleagues at UCLA. So our commitment is sincere, is deep, and it is lasting. Thank you again for joining us, and we will see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.